What's up, guys? Today, let's talk a little bit about GW2. I want to do some Q&A with you. I actually really like all of the questions you all submitted on the last episode, so I'm very much looking forward to answering a few of these. If you've got any questions of your own as the video goes along, you can always leave one in the comments, or if you've been asking one and I seem to have been ignoring it, feel free to spam and ask again. Just keep trying, and eventually it should go through. So specifically in the background, what you guys are going to be seeing, all right, now bear with me, is decorating. But that's a pretty good thing. It might look kind of weird. Eventually, you should be able to tell what we're trying to make. There's going to be lots and lots of little clips. Decorating is weird because I have a lot of fun doing it. And it's like, oh, people have got to see how I built this epic, awesome thing. You can get a bit of a taste if maybe you haven't decorated very much yourself before. And it's going to be kind of curious. So hopefully you guys enjoy that. Let me know what you think. Now, also, just before I run into today's questions, there was something we were talking about on the last episode that I did just want to clarify. Somebody asked me basically about Arenanet's business model for the future when it comes to releasing new expansions. Like, what do they bundle with what? I just want to be clear about exactly what I meant with my answer that last episode, because I think it was construed in some weird ways. Basically, the idea here is that when they release a new expansion, if you buy that expansion, you will get the core game plus all preceding expansions for free, thus making those expansions free, in a sense. So think about a player who bought regular Guild Wars 2 but didn't buy Heart of Thorns. They would then, like, leapfrog and they'd get Heart of Thorns for free. But when I say that they get Heart of Thorns for free, that isn't me saying that Heart of Thorns will be rolled into free-to-play accounts. I don't believe that at all. I think a free-to-play account, basically, is Arenanet being really cheeky and being really smart, actually. They've basically managed to get the news out there like it's some big announcement that, oh, Guild Wars 2 is free-to-play now, when really it's just a trial. Now, ours is a very free trial, and there's a lot you can do in it, so it's kind of okay to call it free-to-play, but I think that's the magician's trick that they've managed to pull on people there. It's a trial, and I think the trial will continue to be a trial. I don't think it will end up having Heart of Thorns rolled into it and all this other stuff, because then people could just be free to play forever, and that isn't the idea. The idea is that they try it out, and then they end up buying it, right, because they want the elite specializations and so on. But there's a question for this week, which is going to dive into that a little bit more. First of all, let's jump straight in with one from Monk D, who said, hey WP, what are your thoughts on the PvP balance post the Bunker Mesmer nerf, and especially I'm looking at the Warrior's effectiveness in the current meta. Warrior's effectiveness? Oh, you're killing me. You slay me, unlike those Warriors. Alright, Warrior, nothing changed really with this patch in terms of the Warrior. What you've got to remember, guys, is the scope of this patch. So for those out of the loop, we had, unfortunately, Heart of Thorns come out, the Raids release, the PvP Leagues release, and Arenanet didn't do any balance patches between that time. They considered the expansion release to be the balance patch, which is mental. So we had the first season, and one of there's some really overpowered stuff. This, because as well, it being the first league, we're seeing a lot of people being really competitive and desperately playing to meta instead of trying to invent their own stuff. And there was a huge swing towards people playing Chronomancer Bunky builds, which really stalled out a lot of the games. When Bunky builds are strong, it can really make things feel unfun. I do not agree that this is the worst meta or the worst that PvP's ever been. I think that's laughably foolish to come out with. But it has been kind of boring. It has been kind of lame. I've talked about it on some recent videos. So what Arenanet did was a little patch to address some of the really, really overtuned stuff, but that is not the main balance patch, alright? So remember the scope of the patch. This patch, Warrior, happens to be basically the worst class at the moment for PvP at the moment. And this patch wasn't there to bring Warrior forward or anything. It was just to address a few small things. And yes, it did bring the Mesmer a little bit more into line, I agree, but nothing super crazy. To me, it's basically meant my Necromancer build's a bit better. I've been playing Condition Damage Necromancer, which wasn't like top tier when the league began, but I was making great progress with it. And some of the only things that really countered me were like some of the strong Revenant things with pulsing resistance on themselves, and now that's not really a thing anymore. And now Chronomancers are slightly less tanky, and they're easier for me to kill in a 1v1 if I have to force myself into that position. So it basically made my Necro build a bit stronger, but that's the scope of it for me and my experience. You're not going to see Warriors or things like that running around. We have to wait for the real balance patch, which comes after this season is over. So yeah. For what it's worth, as well with PvP, I'm barely doing it anymore. The solo queue sadness has got to me. I'll have a dedicated video on that at some point later. Next question. Ilana100 CRT said, hey WP, so a follow-up to your answer to the free-to-play question. Do you think that there's enough incentive to purchase Heart of Thorns? Given that you've dabbled in some free-to-play accounts and understand what is different compared to the full game, do you think Arenanet are incentivizing people to buy the full game effectively? So this leads on from the question. What did I state at the start of this video? That, I mean, Arenanet even themselves have said this, that this business model works because they believe somebody who tries Guild Wars 2 free-to-play will play it for a while and they'll like the game enough that they want the expansion. And Arenanet are comfortable enough that that desire is going to be there, that they can earn their money. Interesting. We've certainly come a long way from GW1, right? Where it was literally just the box and that's all they got. And that would have been a huge risk for them to have originally taken. Even though there were like trials and free things for it, there still are for Guild Wars 1, hell. So is it good enough? I mean, you can play the entire story of the core game. You can get to level 80. You can unlock every skill. You can get to stat cap, Christ, from your free-to-play account. Why would I ever want to upgrade? I think the answer is people, yes, will want to. Not necessarily for the new maps. I think they didn't add enough content for the new maps to seem really enticing. I mean, you're going to get to a point where you've played loads of the game and you're looking at just a couple of new maps. All the quality of life and trait changes, as I explained earlier in the year, all went through into the base game anyway. So for those free-to-play people who are looking at getting Heart of Thorns, they really... the Heart of Thorns maps alone aren't going to incentivize them that much. It's not, especially when people like me are on YouTube and they can just watch videos I put out. Like, look, they're watching it right now. They get to see all the Guild Hall stuff and, you know, in theory, other places they can't go in because there aren't that many maps. We're a long way from what GW1 used to do. You know, they get a huge taste of it, right? They get a massive taste of it. And why would they want to buy? So there is that to consider. But even despite that, I would say that they will be have that incentive. And I think that's literally just because of the elite specializations. Elite specializations not only are overpowered, meaning that if you are, well, not overpowered because they're supposed to be an echelon higher, but they are strong enough that there are very, very few builds you can run in PvP to be competitive. So if you're a PvP free-to-play account person, you're going to get it, right? You're going to, because there are so few builds you can run. Wild versus Wild, there's a little bit more leeway, but once again, you're going to want elite specs, and you're going to be seeing your friends with the elite specs, and that's going to be a lot of incentive for you. Masteries to an extent too, but it really all comes down to the elite specializations, I believe. And then maybe eventually the raids as well, because that's going to be something eventually people want to do. It's very easy to get into an MMO and be like, hey, what's endgame? And our community has very quickly taken hold of that answer being raids. You know, if any free-to-play player asks randomly in Divinity's Reach or something, what's endgame, they're going to hear it's raids, and then they're going to hear the raids are in Heart of Thorns, and then that's going to be incentive for them too. But I believe it's the elite specs are by far and away the winner. All you have to do is look at pre-launch polls of what people are most excited about, and you're damn right it was the elite specs. And I think that they will continue to be very successful, big incentives for people to stay on the most contemporary expansion way off into the future. Oh, one thing as well, though, since you did mention my personal time playing free-to-play accounts, I think that what most players don't recognize as really powerful incentive to upgrade your account when they aren't free-to-play players themselves is the trading post restrictions. Arenanet didn't upgrade them as fast as they should have. But those trading post restrictions really make you want to upgrade your account because you know that you've got so much money tied up there. But I've explained this before. All right, let's move on to the next question. I really like this one from Devin Belver, who said, Aloha, WP. In this expansion, we got gliding as the main specialization feature. I would agree with that, yeah. There were lots of, well, you mean mastery, I suppose. We got loads of masteries, but gliding was like the main one. Do you have any ideas on what the next expansion could bring that could top or equal this feature, gliding? Maybe in the Cogs of War expansion, we can get Charr vehicles or something. This is a fun question. I'm slowly but surely getting better at identifying fun masteries. So here's my list that I wrote in about 20 seconds. You're damn right, Charr vehicles. But let's not just say Charr vehicles, okay? There's a lot in that category. There are tanks. There are the dune buggies that you find in Wild vs. Wild. There are helicopters. In theory, getting complete control of a helicopter for short periods. I mean, that could be kind of interesting. I'm just saying. And then there's an extension as well. I don't know whether you guys would fully consider it a Charr vehicle, but looking back to Guild Wars 1 and what we had in the Blood Legion homelands, we had Siege Devourers that we could mount and we could fire at people. Oh my god, that would be so cool. So Siege Devourers are also an option. But to me, because I want a desert-based expansion so much, I think on the top of my list is either sand surfing, which a lot of people have talked about, like, you know, surfing on the sand dunes or whatever, as well as, you know, mastering the Janundu. The Janundu are made for the mastery system. They are absolutely, I'm so confident that when we get to that region of the world, Janundu are going to come back and they're going to be a part of the mastery system. They have to be. Of course, though, another really great region, there are two other, like, biomes, if you will, that are rich for masteries. Number one is mountains, okay? So the Far Shiver Peaks, this might sound weird, okay? All right? Don't think of Olympics, don't think of sports, all right? But just hear me out. Snowboarding, all right? Or ice skating, right? And I know that myself, but it could work really well. Really fast ways of racing down the mountainsides and, you know, going up ramps and augmenting your boards with magic and stuff. That could be cool, all right? If we're talking a big mobility movement style thing in the mountains, I'd love to see stuff like that. That'd be really awesome. And then the other biome, I suppose, is this considered a biome? But when we're in the deep oceans, when we're in the seas, there are so many things that you can think about for mastery. Whether they decide to go with some kind of breath mechanic, like now the whole aqua breather thing and whatever, that whole breathing, that could be one. Like for the deep oceans, maybe your aqua breathers don't work and they get a mastery. But if they don't want to construct something as arbitrary and weird as that, because they did by design not have breath be a thing. My proposal here would be that through masteries, you eventually learn to breathe forever. So it's not a permanent mechanic. But you can have stuff like pressure as you go into the depths, you know, to be able to withstand the incredible pressures of being very low down, to be able to see in the dark. I love going through these lists. This has actually become really fun for me now, speculating on masteries, and that's great because this time 6 months ago, I really was struggling and I didn't really feel very enthused by any of them. Which is weird to me also to think about because since Heart of Thorns has come out, I'm really not that impressed with the mastery system. I barely ever interact with it at all. Also to consider as well were the old data mined things. There was dinosaur lore, there was shark lore for a while. Interestingly, on the gliding front, there were downward gusts of wind that would knock you out of the air, and there was a mastery for having those not affect you, and they never ended up in the game at all. Now, you might think, that downward gust thing, that could be pretty cool for a future map. Like, you know, not the next expansion, but just Living World Season 3 map, say. Maybe they could have the downward gust of wind. But there's kind of some interesting discussion on the design there, because what you'll have happen is by the way that they've designed the mastery system, if they added a mastery such as that mastery would have to be after leyline gliding. And it would cost like 8 million or 12 million or whatever, like a lot of experience for any consistency in the mastery system, right? It would cost a lot. And then you'd have a Living World update that introduces this new thing and now people can start training it, but suddenly it's a huge wall. It doesn't ease you in like masteries originally. There's just this insane huge wall. And what do Arenanet do? People complain about that. It doesn't quite work. So I'm actually expecting them to not put that in ever, maybe. And instead, unless they like really rebalance a lot of things, and instead just when we get a new map, we'll get a new mastery line altogether so that, you know, you don't kind of experience that jerky style thing. But I'm curious what you guys think about that. Next question is from Otto Frank. He said, hey WP, do you think they should add a bit more lore about the legendary weapons? Like why the Dreamer is the only way we can see unicorns? And what's the point of this metallic Charr head on the incinerator? Look, I know specifically when we look at certain other games, they kind of get a lot more lore for the legendary weapons and stuff. I don't think we're really going to be a franchise that does that. It looks to me like the new precursor crafting system and whatever, it did give us a bit more lore, but it's a couple of lines of flavor text and... You know, be thankful for that. I don't think we're going to see much more ever come in. You know, we just had a big legendary, like, change. And with that change complete now, I think we have to like it or lump it. I would say as well about the unicorn thing, though, and I get that this can be a bit of a problem for people. I don't think we'll ever see, either, another legendary like that come into the game. And I think it's because Arenanet have learned now how much more essential... their legendary weapons are for content in the game. Okay, and what I mean by that is I thoroughly do believe that when they were designing Guild Wars 2 and they were designing the original legendary weapons, they genuinely thought that only the elite of the elite of the elite players would have those legendary weapons, and that world where only very few people have them would persist for a really, really, really long time. But what actually happened was, with the way that they'd been designed, with the lack of alternate content, they released their game, everyone rushed through it, finished it probably faster than Arenanet were expecting, I guess, in many regards, and then had nothing to do but go for legendaries. And so for like 2 years, all we were really doing was a little bit of Living Wild stuff and then going for legendaries. And now you got people with loads of legendaries, and seeing legendaries is very common, and it's basically assumed of your average player that if they're actively playing Guild Wars 2, they're going for a legendary. I know it's maybe it's just because I'm Wooden Potatoes and I've got a bit of an audience and people think I've got loads of wealth or something, which I really don't. It's definitely assumed of me that I'm going for a legendary. Not just among, people to do with YouTube, but with friends as well. It's like, oh, hey, what legendary are you going for? What legendary? Usually people will assume, like, that's kind of what you're doing. And so now legendaries are in a very different place with Heart of Thorns. And even though there's a new method of getting them, I think that Arenanet appreciate that. And I think now that they appreciate that, they kind of changed the design of the weapons that we'll see in the future. At launch, maybe it's okay that you have a crazy short bow that shoots unicorns with tattoos of the Arenanet logo on their hind legs everywhere with a crazy obnoxious sound effect. Maybe they're okay designing that at the start of Guild Wars 2 because they think only very, very, very few players are ever going to have them. But now they know that's not true. Now they know that's one of the primary things people will be going for in the game. It's something that drives a lot of activity, and most people will be really looking at them, and they have to be attainable, right? In some sense, I think they appreciate them as much more attainable things. And now it's like, oh, do we go so extreme? Not to mention I dare not say the word controversy, but not to mention the amount of discussion that revolves around that particular legendary weapon. I doubt they'd want to risk it again. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we'll have a bow that shoots mermaids with the Underwater expansion. And they go, woo! When they're flying through the air before exploding into confetti. We'll see. Next question is from Etienne Arvon, who says, hey, Wooden Potatoes, I got a question for you. Do you feel challenged by the game? I know there's always legendaries and there are grindy things to go for, but is it challenging? All right, so this is an interesting question. I'm guessing since you cited legendaries, you mean specifically from PvE. In terms of PvP, yes, I feel challenged. I feel like there's always something I can do to get better. I do feel like I'm just getting thrown around by RNG a lot as a solo queuer, but definitely if I started going for a team, if I found like-minded people of rough skill level, yes, I think I could absolutely be challenged. I think there's probably a lot of challenge waiting for me in World vs. World 2, especially in terms of like the siege placement game. There's so much, understanding to that kind of stuff. To if I wanted to command in World vs. World, there's a lot of stuff that could challenge me there. But let's talk about PvE. My answer to this question is no. I'm not challenged by PvE, not very much at the moment, but that's actually a good thing, and that's actually okay. And you might think, well, WP, wasn't Heart of Thorns supposed to do that? Wasn't, the general area supposed to be more challenging? Wasn't raids supposed to be a big challenge? I think that there's something that we really have to appreciate with the raid format, and the success of raids is actually heavily dependent on this, and it's actually got very little to do with the content in the raids themselves, and that is the frequency of releases. So let me take it back to the start here. When the raid was first released, Wing 1 was first released, I really wanted challenging content, really wanted it for PvE. I wanted to really dive into my builds, I wanted to play with a lot of people, I wanted to learn a lot about the encounters, and I wanted to have something tough to do, to really challenge me. And I got that. I spent the majority of that week shirking all other responsibilities, spending hours and hours and hours and hours, finally beating bosses, screaming for joy, or when we failed or we wiped at a terrible time, and it was a hell of a lot of fun. But it was a draining amount of time, and by the end I was fatigued, right? By the end I was like, oh my god, we finished it. And now I've kind of been reaping the rewards of that. Over the following weeks we've got better and better and better. They're not particularly challenging anymore. They'd be challenging if I was trying to pug them, or if I was playing with a different group of people, but for the group of people I do it with, we've pretty much got it down pat, and they're not that challenging. But that's a lot of fun right now. It's so much fun right now, knowing how difficult they can be, but how good we are at it, how comfortably we get really decent rewards from Arena. The reward system in raids, once you're good at them, is fantastic. And every week I go in there and I get to, sow what I planted, back when we first started in the raids. If Arenanet 2 weeks ago had dropped Wing 2 of the raid in, I don't think I would have been ready for it. I'm not looking for challenging content right now. Like, I need more, and that itch is slowly growing, and eventually the raid will bore me, you know, and it's not going to take very long for that itch to be bigger, right? Like a month or 2, maybe 3, pushing it. And, you know, at that point, I'm going to want the challenging content back. And at that point, if Arenanet release it at the next wing at the right time, I will stay satisfied, and Heart of Thorns will have scratched that itch for me. So your question, am I challenged by the game? Not right now, but the game is offering me challenge, as long as Arenanet nail the release cycle for the raid wings. And that's going to be interesting to see, like, where they try to balance it. I do believe there's such a thing as releasing the wings too quickly, but we shall see. You know, some people may already be feeling that itch again already. But judging by what I see on the forums, what I see on Reddit, what I see on comments, what I see in game, people still, they're okay. You know, I think in general the community is pretty content, and we're enjoying the first wing, and a lot of people are still going through the progression of that first wing, and Arenanet have bought themselves some time, and that's probably what's quite great about raids too, from a developer standpoint, because they get this time to develop it that is almost necessary time to be there anyway. So that's a bit of, you know, relief off of them, I guess. We'll see. Maybe in 7 months they haven't released another wing, and I'll be very sad at that point, but right now I'm not. The last question is from Mike I the Mighty. He said, hey WP, I'm having a hard time, he says, having had time to evaluate Heart of Thorns, where do you think this rates in terms of expansions for Guild Wars as a franchise? Is it better than Factions? Is it worse than Eye of the North? It's funny, the 2 examples you gave there, because I believe that my answer is the opposite of that. I believe it's worse than Factions, but better than Eye of the North. But this is kind of difficult, because there are 2 methods of comparison, I believe. The first method of comparison, which I think is fairly cruel in many respects, is do you compare everything that Heart of Thorns got you for $50 to everything that Prophecies got you for $50 when you bought it, and you compare them, like, by today's standards. And, you know, that's difficult. You know, if you were to do that Guild Wars 1 to Guild Wars 2, there's no way Guild Wars 1 would ever win. It is graphically inferior. It is mechanically inferior. The engine is far more limited. The stuff that the devs did with it is far more limited. The content is far more sparse and boring. The opportunity to have cool experiences is far more restrictive, because you need so many players to do half the stuff. Like when Prophecy first came out, where there were no heroes and so on, it was a far, far, far worse game. But the reason it's a far, far, far worse game is because you're comparing a 2004 or 5 game to a 2012 game, right? Obviously, there's going to be huge differences there. So that's kind of unfair. But the other way to compare it is sort of how you feel in retrospect about Prophecies compared to Guild Wars 2 Core, I suppose. Or specifically when we're looking at expansions, how much new shininess did Eye of the North add compared to how much new shininess Heart of Thorns added? So here's a really good example. Guild Wars 1, throughout all of its campaigns and all of its glory or whatever, right? It never had much voice acting on characters. So if I spoke to a random merchant, it would just throw up a menu for me. Maybe a little bit of placeholder dialogue. In fact, there was barely any dialogue at all in Prophecies. All the collectors just had generic dialogue. There was barely anything there. And that would be it. You'd make purchases and move on. But then what Eye of the North did was, for the first time, if I spoke to a merchant, the merchant would say, "Greetings, stranger." And then as I, built my reputation up with him, he'd say, "Hello, friend," right? Eventually. And then the non-traders would all be cool with me. And there'd be little Asura voices and so on. And that was really cool. I remember being so pumped about it. I still, to this day, get nostalgic going back to Eye of the North regions alone in Guild Wars 1, because there's all that extra voice-acted dialogue going on. But here's the thing. Heart of Thorns has that too. Except with Heart of Thorns, it's not a new shiny improvement because Guild Wars 2 Core had it. So do we credit it or not? The best I can do, I suppose, in summation, is spitball it. I think that the amount of content, like the amount of story, the amount of maps, the scope of Heart of Thorns is far too small to say that it's better than Nightfall or Factions. I think it's basically impossible to compare it to Prophecies, but maybe we can go down that rabbit hole in the comments if we'd like. I would say, though, Heart of Thorns is better than Eye of the North. Eye of the North was a nice improvement, and it was, but in terms of the content scope, they're a little bit more similar. But when you look at Heart of Thorns in total with all the Guild Hall stuff, I think Heart of Thorns probably edges it out for me over Eye of the North. But in terms of like core campaigns, Eye of the North was released cheaper, wasn't it? Wasn't it like half price? Well, Heart of Thorns is a full price experience and still smaller than even Eye of the North was. which is very sad to me. Just the Heart of Thorns is crippled in so many respects because it's too small scope. Very sad. Anyway, there you go, guys. I'd love to hear what your opinion is on that. There's today's Q&A. Do feel free to leave any questions you like down below. We will have another episode of the Patreon one coming very soon. But I hope you guys are having a good time. I hope you enjoyed the footage. And I guess I'll see you tomorrow. Have a great evening, everyone.